Welcome back to my translation analysis of Final Fantasy IX, a series where I compare the English and Japanese scripts of the game, going over the most fun and interesting differences, and hopefully enhancing your appreciation of the game's story and characters in the process. If this is your first time, then I recommend you go back and watch the first episode, which begins with a formal introduction to this series, where I explain my modus operandi in more detail. Speaking of which, there were two things I forgot to mention in that introduction. The first is simple. Expect spoilers in general, including those that take place later in the story, since I'll occasionally need to bring them up in order to give context to certain lines. The second one is, see, with a 40-hour game like Final Fantasy IX, this is inevitably going to be a long series. So in the interest of keeping things interesting, as well as not driving myself crazy, I will be focusing largely on the story and not so much on the menus, abilities, items, or NPC dialogues. I will also be selective when it comes to the story, meaning I may skip over an entire section here and there if there isn't anything about the translation that I find especially striking or interesting. But hey, if you're really curious about a particular line or something, feel free to let me know down in the comments and perhaps I could go over it when we get there. No promises, but maybe, especially if a certain line is heavily requested. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get into the episode. Final Fantasy IX does this neat little thing where every time you enter a new location, the name of the place slowly fades into the screen in big letters, sometimes after a brief introductory scene. These can be pretty interesting in the Japanese version, which actually includes English text as well, although not always the exact same words that the English translation uses. The same applies to the descriptive subtitles that follow the names of certain locations. These can be completely different from English to Japanese, and sometimes they're even cut from the English version altogether. Alexandria gives us the first example of that. Whereas in English all it says is Alexandria, in Japanese it says Alexandria, Jokamachi. The word Jokamachi uses 3 different characters or kanji. Kanji are the Chinese characters adopted for the Japanese writing system. The characters used to form this word are the kanji for castle, below, and town. Put them all together and you get Jokamachi, which essentially means a town built adjacent to or surrounding a castle. In other words, a castle town. So the subtitle gives a little bit of extra information about Alexandria, although I guess we kind of already knew it had a castle from the gorgeous FMV prior to this scene, so it's obviously not a big deal that the English version decided to go with a simple one-word title instead. Anyway, in the first episode, we spent a lot of time analyzing Vivi's title card, but in this one, we get to meet him in person and see what he normally sounds like. Vivi quite literally speaks like a child, and in Japanese this is further reinforced by how his written dialogue uses very little kanji and keeps mostly to simple kana, or Japanese syllabary. This is because children usually can't read that many kanji yet. Now I know many of you probably can't either, even though you're adults, but you ain't from glorious Nippon, so it's alright, don't feel bad. Now, as some of you might know, and by some I mean anime watchers, the Japanese language possesses many different first-person pronouns, which is rather unusual and virtually impossible to translate, since in English pretty much everyone just says I. The word Vivi uses to refer to himself is boku, a pronoun typically used by young boys, which gives off a far more humble vibe than Zidane's more informal and virile ore. Of course, we soon find out that Vivi is not only humble but also a bit wimpy at first, and in Japanese this produces an amusing pun, which I'm not even sure was intentional. See, after Vivi meets another boy named Puck, the two climb the rooftops of Alexandria to sneak into the castle and watch it play. But Vivi is afraid of heights and thus rather hesitant to cross a shoddy-looking piece of wood connecting two rooftops, which is when Puck reprimands him with the following line. Daijoubu datte, bibinna yo, ochinaite. In English, this line was translated as, don't worry, it won't fall. More literally translated, what Puck says is, it's alright, don't be scared, it ain't gonna fall. Now, what's funny or interesting about that, you may ask? Well, the word used for being scared there is actually bibi, from the verb bibiru, which means to feel afraid or to get cold feet. And in Japanese, that is exactly how you write and say Vivi's name, Bibi. In fact, his name is revealed right after this moment, when Vivi and Puck finally tell each other and the audience their names, and Puck even comments on how Vivi's name is kinda weird. I've seen fans speculate as to possible meanings behind Vivi's name before, like the past tense of the verb to live in certain Latin languages like Spanish or Portuguese, but maybe it's a reference to him starting out as a bit of a scaredy cat, you know? Hence his name being literally the stem of the Japanese verb to be scared. Who knows? Maybe not. But this line did get a laugh out of me, so I kinda had to share it. Anyway, Vivi and Puck make it in time to watch the ensuing play, I Want to Be Your Canary, and the English script really shines here, with its apt use of Shakespearean English. Wouldn't have it any other way, of course, since in universe the play was written by one Lord Avon, whose name is a reference to one of Shakespeare's nicknames, the Bard of Avon. And no, he wasn't Spoony. You know who kinda was Spoony though? Zidane after meeting Princess Garnet. Can't really blame him though, she was totally rocking that classic white mage hoodie. Now Garnet is of course another main party member, and in a trend that will continue for a while, she uses another unique personal pronoun, watashi, which is exceedingly formal and thus befitting of her status as royalty. In fact, her overall speech is dripping with formality to an extent that can almost only exist in a language with such ingrained hierarchies of formality as Japanese. And yet, the English translation does a very good job of conveying the same effect with such awesome phrases as, "Then I shall take my leave of you," which is surely the nicest way Zidane has ever been dumped by a lady. Interestingly enough, when Zidane finally catches up to her and vows to safely kidnap her as per Garnet's request, he momentarily adopts a very formal speech as well. See, Japanese possesses various forms of formal honorific speech, referred to as keigo, a word that is written with a kanji for to respect and language. Here Zidane employs a particular form of keigo called kenjogo, which is distinctly humble and self-effacing. He even goes as far as to refer to himself with Garnet's own usual pronoun of watashi, but with the me suffix added to indicate humility. Likewise, when saying you, he goes with the highly respectful anata-sama, rather than the informal anta or omae he usually employs. As I alluded to before, the drastic and radical nature and degree of this shift in tone and speech is virtually impossible to fully preserve in English, but again, they did a very good job with him starting a sentence with, "I shall hereby do my best to kidnap you." Since Final Fantasy IX is a game full of references to past games in the series, next up we're introduced to Kefka's Hellspawn children, Zorn and Thorn. In Japanese, the former finishes all his sentences with ojaru and the latter with gojaru. These are from an old dialect that has fallen out of use, and needless to say, they don't possess any real equivalent in English, so the localization team just had one of them go full Yoda. Hey, any better? I could not have done. The two jesters inform Beatrix that Princess Garnet has run away with a royal pendant, and the general relays that information to Queen Brahne, who reacts with the following line in English.
Well, of all the... what could she be thinking?
Personally, I'd say this reaction sounds a bit more innocent and innocuous than the Japanese, where she says,
Nandato? Ano komusume wa nani o kangaete oru no ja?
The word she uses to refer to Garnet in Japanese isn't something as neutral as she, but rather komusume, which is often used as a demeaning or derogatory way to refer to a young girl. So right away we can see that there's some pre-existing tension between the queen and the princess, and thus potential for a family quarrel of royal proportions, which of course is what will keep us busy for the better part of 2 discs. In this scene we're also introduced to our 4th party member, the captain of Alexandria's Pluto Knights, Adalbert Steiner, who probably has the most archaic speech of all the main characters, and of course keeps up the trend of each party member using a different personal pronoun. He refers to himself with jibun, a word which literally means oneself or one's own, and much more often than not is used in the same way the English word is, but sometimes it can also appear as a personal pronoun, one that sounds more distant than the more common options, almost as if the speaker is drawing a line between themselves and the listener. It's a rather rigid form, typical of soldiers, so it's not too surprising to hear it coming from Sir Rustalot here. Incidentally, that loving nickname of Rusty, which Zidane soon bestows upon Steiner, was a rather inspired localization, as in the Japanese version he simply calls him Osan, which anyone who's watched a couple of anime will recognize as a very informal and potentially rude way of addressing a middle-aged man. I suppose they could have just had Zidane call him Pops as a more direct translation, but Rusty is a pretty awesome and hilarious nickname, so I'm glad they went with it. We eventually return to the play, where in Japanese Baku informs us that the character of Schneider is the prince of a kingdom called Sasune, which just so happens to be a location in Final Fantasy III. In English, he just says his kingdom, and the name of Schneider's land remains forever a mystery. This is one of various names and references to previous Final Fantasies that were lost in the translation process. This one was cut altogether, but in other cases it also happens due to Final Fantasy IX's translation of such names not matching up to the English translation of previous games. We'll be looking at some of those over the course of this series. And speaking of this series, the second episode has now come to a close along with the play, as our merry band of heroes are forced to escape from Alexandria before crash landing right into Evil Forest. In the next episode, we'll be taking a deeper look at Zidane as well as Blank and the dynamic between the two. It's gonna be a juicy one, so make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet and don't want to miss it. And don't forget to like this one if you did indeed like it. If you didn't, thanks for watching till the end anyway. That's all for now. See you later, Chocobros.